From the time of his leaving college, when I first met Dorner, his whole life was given up to research work. He was an ardent paleobotanist, and his passion for delving into the history of bygone plants was as keen as that of an archaeologist among mummies. Like them, he was prepared to go through any dangers for the sake of new discoveries, and I received letters from all parts of the world where he was digging among the rocks in the hope of finding fossils of unknown prehistoric plants. His house in Surrey, where he lived with his old servant, contained the cabinets where he kept the magnificent collection of curiosities and relics of ever-growing interest. Apart from these botanical treasures, the rooms were a museum for rare shells, weird insects, precious stones, idols, and what-nots. I would spend happy weekends browsing among these curios, and I am afraid I envied him the job, which seemed infinitely better than my stockbroking one. However, at 40, Dorner had still not attained his ambition. When I could get down from town for the evening, we would potter round his charming garden and discuss his pet scientific points. "I am positive," he would say, "that some day they will discover a fossilized seed in which a fertile embryo will be found. Then we will really be able to know what a prehistoric plant was like." We argued this point so often. I used to tease him. "How can you expect a seed that has been embedded for millions of years to sprout? You might as well hope to find a sleeping dinosaur. Besides, seeds germinate upon the ground, not on the plant, and in that time of great heat they germinated at once." He would put forth the instance of the toad that had been imprisoned in a stone for centuries and was still alive. "A reptile," I said. "We're talking of vegetables." Dorner had a theory that the missing link between human beings and the rest of the living world would eventually be established through plants. He argued that the functions of plants are identical with those of men. "They have never gone on their bellies like animals. I believe there is a direct connection between them and us." "Well, how did we manage without our roots?" I would put in. "It is hardly necessary for some plants to have roots. They exist chiefly by air taken in by their leaves." Sitting in his garden one evening on the day before his departure on a long tour of research, he broke silence by saying, "You know, I think the legend of the mandrake must have some truth in it." "The mandrake was supposed to squeak, wasn't it?" I asked. "It screamed when it was uprooted, and the roots had a human shape. Don't you see the connection with Dante's story of the free people in hell, and the Maya symbol of a branching body?" "I can't quite see what you're driving at. Those were allegories." "There is truth at the bottom of all allegories and legends. The fact has been proved time and time again. Why, there are meat-eating plants now, plants that move, that have digestive powers as we have." "Well?" I asked. "Millions of years ago, in some great geological upheaval, there may have been destroyed a plant which had become free of the soil, which lived by oxygen, as we do." "A kind of emancipated cabbage?" I suggested. It was impossible not to poke fun at Dorner. He was like a child when he got on to his pet theory, but he took my chaff in good part. Next day I saw him off on his expedition to India, where he was to lead a research party to the lesser-known portions of Gondwana land. This region they knew to be rich in species of permo-carboniferous flora. Dorner looked like a plant himself as he stood on the deck, waving goodbye. His thin little body was rigid, while his arms brandished a walking-stick and 2 green-topped butterfly nets. After a few months I began to have letters from him. They had found some excellent specimens of Glossopteris flora, relics of some hitherto unknown plants. They had had exciting adventures with snakes, and so on. After that I heard no more until one morning I received a telegram from a remote station in India. It was like Dorner to wire. In his excitement he couldn't wait for the post to impart his news. What he had to say thrilled me, though I was not so keen on paleobotany as my friend. Returning at once. Discovered apparently fertile seed. Sale, Sinai, June 26th. Dorner. I realized the importance of the discovery. None of these embedded seeds had so far shown any powers of germination. If this seed should quicken, it would mean the recreation of a plant which had its being in those past ages that we can only guess at. I met Dorner on his arrival in England, and we went back to his house. He seemed smaller and thinner than ever, but wild with excitement and enthusiasm. We sat up late in his little sitting-room, while he described his adventures and exhibited his trophies. The wonderful seed was displayed with the reverent pride of a young mother displaying her firstborn. It had been discovered among several other fossilized seeds in the Talchin border beds. Why it had not germinated was a mystery, but it was still fertile, and Dorner had decided to plant it under the conditions he thought would be most natural to it. In appearance it had the fleshy consistency of a nasturtium seed, with the same crinkled skin. But whereas that is generally green or brown, this was a sickly yellow. But one should be lenient with a complexion when it's a few million years old. What I could not forgive was the seed's strong resemblance to a dried maggot. I pointed this out to Dorner, hiding my repugnance as best I could. "You don't think you have got hold of a fossilized grub by mistake?" I asked facetiously. He was hovering tenderly over the curled, black-headed little body lying in its bed of cotton wool, and answered with great lack of humour. "Don't be an ass. This may prove my theory. I wonder what sort of temperature a specimen of this sort would require." For the next few weeks I believe his spirit lived in the Paleozoic age, while he tried to emulate the climate with what scientific aids he possessed. During this time he was very mysterious about the seed, and allowed no one near the greenhouse where it had been planted. However, I turned up one evening at his house, and he took me down the garden with Tim, his fox terrier, dancing at our heels. The little dog was no more excited than his master. Dorner was positively trembling. The only words he said were, "It's sprouted. Come and see." The conservatory was stacked with electric heaters, artificial light, and, in fact, every appliance he could think of to give the plant a better chance. He would not allow Timmy in. He might get entangled among the wires and things. We both adored Timmy. Leaving him to bark dolefully outside, we advanced into the Holy of Holies. I found Dorner had arranged a kind of barricade among the seed-beds. Evidently winds were not allowed to blow upon it, or the sun to beat too fiercely. It might have been an emperor's couch which we approached, but though I smiled to myself I could not but feel awe-stricken. Here was the descendant of plants which had flourished when our world of man was not thought of, when enormous and grotesque reptiles walked the oozy earth and fought with each other for the mastery. And now nothing remained of them but a few hoarded bones. Dorner switched off an electric battery which was doing its best to persuade the embryo that it was back in the Dark Ages, and presented to me a large pot full of earth. "I noticed it this morning," he said in a whisper. Bending curiously over the earth, I saw a small white object protruding above the surface. "Oh, is that the seed?" I asked. He nodded. "I've been to endless trouble getting the right chemicals for the soil. I wrote to Edgar for particulars. He is an expert on what soil was made of at that time. Judging by the result, I must have got the right ingredients." I looked more closely at the tiny plant, and as I gazed it seemed to writhe upwards like a worm does as it presses its way through the ground. I felt suddenly sick. "It's moving," I said. "Yes," gasped my friend. "That's the most marvellous thing about it. It shows my theory was true. It moves of its own accord." We went out of the stifling greenhouse to meet the joyous, bounding Timmy. After that there was no doubt about the seed having germinated. To give it more freedom, there were no pots in the Paleozoic age, Dorner moved it into a specially prepared bed in the greenhouse. When it was large enough to receive visitors, scientists called upon it. Reporters waited for interviews. It was photographed. Botanical papers wrote long articles about it. It was christened Dorner Cordianthus, as paleobotanists earnestly agreed it belonged to that family. Dorner himself considered it more of a Cycadian type, but subsequent events proved him wrong. I was much too ill-versed in the technical knowledge of these things to argue the point, but I was very proud of being one of the first to see it in its infancy. It certainly grew at a tremendous pace. This must have been due to the artificial aids received. A fortnight after my first visit, I inspected the plant again, and was astonished at its rapid development. The Cordianthus now had the appearance of a tree, and was nearly 2 feet high. Branch-like shoots protruded from the upper part of its stem or trunk, which measured about 2 inches in circumference. White in colour, it was lined all over by a network of brownish veins that evidently formed some part of the system of circulation. The whole growth was covered with fine hairs, as one sees on a poppy stalk. These hairs became sharp, hard points or thorns when approaching the ends of the shoots. The shoots did not develop from the ends like ordinary plants. There were no budding leaves or flowers. They were in the nature of suckers, each having a worm-like heart surrounded by the thorns, while the branch body grew from the parent stem, becoming broader and longer, but never losing its original shape. These sucker-like heads expanded or contracted as the plant swayed, for it swayed like seaweed in a swell, but there was no current to sway it. As if in some unfelt wind, it writhed up and down with a horrible rhythm of its own. The word growth adequately expressed the impression that the plant gave me. It had the decayed appearance of a fungus, rather than the freshness of a shrub. Also, there was none of that roughness of texture one sees on the bark of shrubs. The main stem from which the branches grew was smooth as they were. The joint was invisible like the arms of a body. That was what it reminded me of, but not a human body, more like an attenuated octopus, with its sucker-like tendrils growing out and lengthening as the thing got bigger. And it always kept up that slow, horrible, swaying movement. The thing was alive like an octopus. I turned to Dorner, who was watching it with adoring eyes. "Have you ever tried to kill it?" I asked. "Kill it?" he exclaimed in horror. "Yes. Have you ever tried to find out whether it will die like an animal, I mean? Some plants are harder to kill than animals." "For instance?" "Well, the ordinary convolvulus is pretty hard to eradicate from a garden. At least I find it so. Chop it off at one end, it will come up in bunches somewhere else. It has worm-like roots, rather like this." "Fancy comparing a common thing like that with Cordianthus," exclaimed Dorner. "It grows nearly as quickly as this," I answered. "I could swear it has done some growing while we were here." He swelled with pride. "Isn't it marvellous? And we are practically the first who have ever seen it." It certainly was wonderful, but I thought as I watched those undulating suckers moving in its blind rhythmic way, that before the climate in that long past time got too hot or too cold for it, the Cordianthus could not have been nearly so decorative as our simple little convolvulus. Dorner stepped forward and touched one of the tendrils. Instantly, as though an electric message had passed through the whole body, all the suckers turned to the one his hand rested on. "Take care!" I cried. A thorn had pricked him. There was a drop of blood on the whitish surface of the plant. Dorner took out his handkerchief to wipe the stain away, but I stopped him, saying, "Leave it there. It will be gone tomorrow." "But why should it go? And it looks beastly." I pointed to the soaring heads which were bunching together round the red splodge. They will suck it up. It's blood they want. Dorner stared at me. You mean it's insectivorous? But it's quite a different sort of plant. I think it's carnivorous, I answered. You'll have to give it something to eat. Those worm things want something more than carbon dioxide. Just outside the greenhouse door, on our way in to tea, was a small white object pressing its way through the turf. I showed it to Dorner. You needn't have worried about all those electric contrivances. Our Cordianthus seems to be making itself very much at home. My friend was on his knees examining the tiny shoot. It must have sunk its roots right under the greenhouse, he said in an awed voice. I laughed. The climate of England seems to agree with it. You'll be having it popping through the drawing-room carpet next. I believe it gnaws its way up. Rot, said Dorner. It's funny it hasn't any leaves, though. Perhaps there will be some kind of bloom. Well, let's hope it will be a nice-looking one whenever it thinks fit to come out. We went in to tea. I was right about the plant's growth. In a week or so Dorner's lawn was punctuated with its writhing tendrils. Evidently it grew faster underground than in the air. Dorner was obliged to destroy some of them. He even dug down and cut the roots away, but this was as useless as destroying a convolvulus. He said it was like cutting worms in half and made him sick. Then the neighbours, who at first were anxious to have cuttings from the new plant, began to complain. The Cordianthus was sprouting all over their gardens. "And I don't like the look of it," said the vicar's wife. "I've never seen a tree that moves without anything to move it. Please take it away, Mr. Dorner. It's coming up all among my vegetables." There began a regular campaign against the Cordianthus in Dorner's garden, as well as others. His lawn presented a mass of sprouting worms, to which weed-killer and the spade were vigorously applied. He was content to keep one specimen, which grew outside the greenhouse. The one inside had died of a mysterious disease. We were at a loss to know what had killed it. Dorner thought the heat had been too great, but I harboured the view that it had starved to death. We watched the emaciated body quiver in a last agony like an animal. "It wants meat," I said, nauseated by the sight. Dorner would not believe that it was carnivorous. How could it get meat in the Paleozoic age? He argued. I'm giving it a special sort of water with chemicals in it, which Edgar sent me. Suffice it to say, the thing died. One evening we were sitting in the garden discussing the surviving plant. There had been a stream of complaints that morning from the houses round about. People could not eradicate the roots from their land. The cartloads of weed-killer they must have bought would sink a ship, said Dorner, sighing. I believe they are afraid of the thing. Afraid or not, I answered, it's not jolly to have it hanging about in flower-beds. My friend stroked Timmy's soft coat tenderly. I think there will be a flower soon, now it's got into the right environment. The greenhouse was evidently too hot. As we know, it must have existed in the Permo-Carboniferous strata when things were getting a bit cooler, owing to glaciers. The reason for this seed having been fertile but never germinating was a sudden catastrophe of some kind, flood, earthquake or landslide which submerged it. It certainly possesses the vitality which would account for its tenacity to life, I commented. Dorner seemed to have dropped his theory of plant and human connection. Once or twice I caught him looking at the tree with aversion in his eyes. It now stood about 4 feet high, and in the full light of the afternoon sun presented a particularly white and uncanny appearance. The crowd of suckers which formed its branches curled and uncurled gently in the summer air. A vigorous extermination of all subsidiary shoots had left it for the moment the sole survivor on our lawn. I suppose it will die in the winter, said Dorner presently. "I hope so," I answered. The remark did not cause the flare of temper I expected. "I don't believe I should care," he said with the naivety of a child. "Not since this morning." "What happened this morning?" "I went up close to have a look at it, and one of the suckers twisted round my arms. It took quite a time to get it off. It showed extraordinary strength." I stopped to pat Timmy, who lay by our feet. "Why don't you cut it down?" Dorner looked apologetic. "It's such an extraordinary thing. Seems a pity to destroy it. But if it dies a natural death, I shan't mind. I suppose it would have to be killed sometime simply because it shows a propensity to live. I expect in the Dark Ages, or whenever the thing existed, there was plenty of room to spread. No back gardens there." Dorner smiled. How keen Rayland would have been to see it. He reconstructed the Cordianthus, you know, although I have never agreed this had the slightest resemblance to that family. As Dorner spoke, a bird fluttered onto one of the slowly moving branches. With the swiftness of a snake, the bough it rested on lapped round the struggling body and crushed it to death. I sprang to my feet. If a hatchet had been in my hand instead of a stick, the tree would have been hacked to pieces. I struck furiously again and again. Dorner came to the rescue. "It's no use doing that. The bird's dead. There will be another cause for complaint among the neighbours if it starts eating the livestock. Evidently that's what it has been needing." I saw the scientist was transcendent in him, or I would have pleaded for the venomous thing to be destroyed. Dorner, however, was obsessed by the idea of seeing a possible flower, and he would not give up that hope without a struggle. Business kept me in town a good deal, and I did not see much of him. He wrote that he was in trouble again with the neighbours. They threatened to take action against him for still keeping the plant. Then I had a heartbroken letter saying that poor little Timmy was dead. He had been found curled up in the tree with the suckers massed about his body like a swarm of bees. "I killed the Cordianthus," wrote Dorner. "Dug it up and burnt it. People can't grumble any more. But it wasn't for their silly sakes I killed the thing. I was so mad with rage about Timmy. It might have spared him. I used to give it hunks of meat, too." Poor Dorner. But one might as well bring an ichthyosaurus into our civilized world and keep it as a pet. I hoped he would plan another expedition soon and forget his disappointment. I was away in Paris for a month, and when I came back I rang him up. As a rule, he came to the telephone himself, and I was surprised when his old servant answered. "The professor is not here, sir. We have been trying to find you, to ask if you knew where he had gone." "When did he go?" I asked. "He's been away 3 days, sir. I don't know what to do. He's not left any address." Evidently the responsibility of his vanished master was proving too great, and the man was anxious I should come down. I did not feel anxious, as I knew Dorner was upset about his plant, and had probably gone off for a change, not wishing to be bothered with letters. However, things began to look serious when I found that no luggage had been taken, and my friend had not said anything about going away. I rang up the police. Why his man had not done so before was a mystery to me, but I suppose he did not wish to do so for fear of annoying Dorner. He had just gone on from day to day, hoping his master would turn up. The police arrived and questioned old Standish as to when he had last seen his master. It was after tea 3 days ago. He had seen Dorner go down the garden smoking a pipe. "Did the gentleman say anything to you before he went out?" "Yes, sir. He said he was going out to get some weed killer." "Why did he want weed killer?" "I don't know what he wanted it for specially, sir. He used it a great deal lately." "What on?" "For that queer plant of his, sir. It kept coming up in odd places." "I see. And where did he keep the weed-killer?" "In the greenhouse at the bottom of the garden." "And are you sure Mr. Dorner didn't come back to the house again?" "I couldn't be sure of that, sir, because I went back to the scullery after I saw him leave the house." "Could you see the garden from the scullery?" "No, sir, it's at the back." "And when did you begin to be disturbed by your master's absence?" "I had supper ready for him and rang the bell, but he never came in." "Was he generally punctual for meals?" "Not as a rule, sir. I've known him stay out till 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning. That's why I didn't worry as much as I might have done." "But in the morning, when he was not in his room, what did you think then?" "I didn't know what I ought to do, sir. I didn't like to ring up Scotland Yard in case he'd come in and find the place full of policemen." The sergeant bore this well. "But you should have got into communication with us before this, you know. I suppose you searched the house?" The old man had looked everywhere. The greenhouse and surrounding shrubberies were examined, and the local ponds were dragged. The excitement became intense. People forgot their quarrel about Cordianthus and became full of solicitude. "Such a charming man! I do hope nothing has happened. He was so eccentric, wasn't he?" For myself, I wished I had not left Dorner at a time when he needed a friend. I was afraid his disappointment about his plant must have affected his brain. All the same, there seemed no particular reason why he should have been so upset. I noticed several little white shoots coming up on the lawn, which showed the Cordianthus was still throwing out hostages to fortune. But from where? Leaving the inspector and his men to ferret among the bushes in their search for footprints and so on, I retraced my steps to the house. A member of the force was at the front door talking with Standish. "And the cellars?" I heard him say. "Did you go through them?" There was only the wine cellar and the coal hole, but I remembered another room which Dorner always kept locked, and which the old man with his limited intelligence would not have thought of looking in. This cellar room was very dark and was used for storing certain specimens Dorner had brought home, which required a damp atmosphere. I did not remember it having been opened lately, and suddenly understood what had been in my friend's mind when he got the weed-killer. I beckoned to the sergeant, and he followed me down the cellar steps. "I don't think Standish will have searched this part of the house," I explained. "Mr. Dorner generally kept this room locked. Hello! The door's half open." We had come to the door, and I tried to push through. It resisted me strangely, as if some pliant body leant against it on the inside. Then, as I persisted, the door gave way, and we saw a crowd of white, slowly moving arms stretching out towards the light. A spectral tree was growing from the damp earth floor of the cellar, its trunk long and attenuated, with branches which stretched up till they crushed against the low ceiling. In the midst of them, and close in their white embrace, was the body of Dorner. It was wrapped and locked in a mass of suckers. He must have come down here to find out where the roots came from, and touched one of the starved things by mistake. It had wound about his throat, a rooted octopus. I and the sergeant hacked it to pieces, but Dorner was dead. On some of the hairy tendrils something had grown. It was a kind of scarlet fungus blotching over the sickly branches. The Cordianthus had flowered at last. Whether before or after Dorner's death no one could tell. I will not describe the condition he was in. The plant was carnivorous, and it had taken what it could get.